switch sides there. All right.
And I'd probably just say hello and then we go to the first image.
Yeah. All right. Let me make sure it's working everywhere. Perfect. There. All right. As everyone's hopping on, feel free to drop in the chat and let us know where you're coming from. I'm just making sure everything is streaming right. All right. Perfect. There we go. Excellent. So, greetings, everyone.
Philip, Wolfgang.
Oh, yeah. We have people popping in from all over. Very glad you're here.
Nice.
This is the second session for the Christmas stories. We're going to be digging into the Gospel of Matthew today. Before you drop in, I just realized something from emails. For those that don't know, if there are 2,400 of the 3,500 of you have been in multiple homebrewed classes before, so y'all all knew me. There are a few of you that have never listened to the podcast or been in one of the homebrewed classes who sent me emails and was like, you didn't introduce yourself. You just talked about Dom, which sorry, which I'm very glad you're here. So while everyone's hopping on, I'll just say something real quick. My name's Tripp. I grew up a Baptist preacher's kid in the South. Was super nerdy. Found out the Bible was broken when I was 5 because things didn't line up. And that's how I met Dom. Started reading all the historical Jesus books in my father's library. Remained a super nerd. In middle school and high school, I started theology reading groups and started reading Kierkegaard and Tillich and Bonhoeffer and all that kind of stuff. Did theater and philosophy in undergrad, did a divinity degree at Wake Forest University, did a PhD in process philosophy of religion in Claremont. It was a joint program of the philosophy and religion department. Did a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh, where I taught religion and science, primarily philosophy of religion for their philosophy department. And the second half of the year-long religion science class, which is the biological sciences and brain sciences and how it works for theology and such. I hang out on the internet since 2008. I was doing divinity school when Dom was first on the podcast. This year, we will pass 5 million downloads in the last year in Homebrewed Christianity. There's if you type my name in on the internet, there's plenty of things that come up. Yeah. But for all the people that are new, it's a little bit about me. I've wrote 2 books on Jesus, but they're theology books. One's a fun history of how the Christology developed. The other one is super nerdy. It's broadly a process relational Christology book. And I have 2 things I'm working on religion science, panpsychism, pan-experientialism, and a big project called The Mindfulness of Nature, which is looking at consciousness studies and how that changes philosophy of religion if the battle and understanding the phenomena of religion isn't between materialist and supernatural dualist. What happens when you have a more thick account of nature? Anyway, if people, I'm really into Lord of the Rings, take it way too seriously. And yeah, there you go. So if you don't know me, there you go. You can Google more. But so this is always fun for me as someone who spends most of his time doing philosophy, theology type stuff. Most of our classes at Homebrewed or more in that style. Every time I get to hang out with Bible nerds, if you just heard the 15 minutes of Dom and I before we hit record, it is quite a bit of fun. But yeah, there we go. So with that, here's what we're going to do today. Remember, everyone, you are more than welcome to hop in and drop your questions in the chat wherever you are. We'll see them and I can save them. I've got a stack of questions people sent in. Don will kick things off. He will share. He's got his visual presentation. Then I'll follow up. We'll have some conversation about it. Then I'll start asking questions that y'all have sent in. And when we get done, you'll say, whoo, That was intense. I can't wait till next week. So that was a lot in a minute and a half right there.
All right, Trip. So if you want to go to the first.
Oh yeah, here we go. Let me make sure we got there. It's all loading up.
Everything looks good. And welcome to everyone, whether you're watching today or you're watching anytime during the next year. Reminding you, we're doing visual classes. They're image-based. That's what I mean by that. And the three parts will be celebrating, questioning, and explaining. But celebrating is terribly important. So those are the three parts today. And we go to the next image. All right, it's visual class 2. I keep insisting on visual class, as you can see. Matthew 1 and 2, here's the thesis, the proposal. Matthew 1 and 2 as a parabolic overture to Matthew. And there were some questions came in about that, and they were very good questions. Parabolic overture, both terms are equally important, but it's not enough, in other words, to show it's simply an overture. You could grant that and say, well, couldn't it be an historic overture? Of course it could. It could be. It could be. Historic overture would mean that we're getting information about what actually happened, about Herod and about the Magi and everything else, and their magic star, and all of that is intended to be factual. Now, a huge subtext today is the continuity from Moses to Jesus, from Old to New Testament, if you want to use the Christian terms. And I'm emphasizing that because next week it's going to be more about discontinuity. So then if we can move to the next image, and I'm going to inflict on you a little bit of important autobiographical trivia, possibly, but it really is connected with why this is not just an overture or an historical overture, but a parabolic overture. I entered the Roman Catholic religious order, as you probably know, when I was 16 in 1950. So I got my name Dominic. It's not a legal name. It's a liturgical or a religious name. So I was ordained in 57, and my religious superiors, because I had 5 years of Greek, 5 years of Latin in a classical boarding school in Ireland, which kind of amazed them a bit. Didn't amaze me at the time. I just thought that's what everyone did. They sent me back to Ireland, to Maynooth College, now National University of Ireland, part of it, in 57 to 59 to get a doctorate. Actually, it was a doctorate in theology, strictly speaking, the doctorate in divinity, because the Roman Catholic tradition likes Latin roots like divinity rather than Greek roots like theology. So for the 2 years there, I was at what's called the Dunboyne Institute in that magnificent building. Look at the date over at the other side, 1796. This was built a couple of years after the French Revolution, so by the British government, by the way. The British government financed this so that Irish students wouldn't go to Europe and get bad French ideas about freedom and equality and other such things. So they built this magnificent, kind of modeled on the Oxford and Cambridge quads edifice. Anyway, I got my doctorate there. And then immediately after that, my superiors, going to the next slide, they sent me to Rome for a 2-year postdoctoral specialization at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. You can see it there. It's in Piazza della Polata, just down the street from the Trevi Fountain, as it were, in from the Corso. And for 2 years there, this is when I learned what I'm going to be giving you today. This is when I had to do a thesis. I'd done my doctoral dissertation, but I had to do a thesis for the master's in biblical studies, a specialization. And I focused it on in Matthew 1 and 2, and how the infancy of Jesus was modeled by Matthew on the infancy of Moses. Now, that was an argument that it was an overture. And at the end, I'm going to come back to you why it was not advisable for me in the year 1961, the year before the Second Vatican Council began at the Biblical Institute, to suggest, and I was far too smart to suggest, that it might have been a parabolic, which is a nice word for a fictional overture. I was fairly certain that would not get me or get me out of there a little faster than I needed to go. So hold on to that. that it's possible to hold on to Matthew 1 and 2 as an overture, but not necessarily as a parabolic overture. And so I want to be stressing that in this. Okay, now moving to the next image. Part 1 then, celebrating Matthew 1 and 2, this time in ivory. I did keep for continuity those lovely Catalan medallions for Matthew and Luke with Jesus trying to come out behind them, as it were. But the last time we were talking about stone and emphasizing the continuity for Gaudi in his masterpiece, La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, that the infancy, Christianity, comes out of human evolution and is an organic part of it. Today, I'm going to be looking at ivory, not stone, ivory. Next week, we look actually at mosaic, but ivory this time. And if you go to the next image, please. Celebrating then with ivory. We're looking at a magnificent casket. I suppose it's about, maybe 2 feet wide, roughly. It's in the Farfa Abbey, north of Rome, made in 1060, probably, I suspect, to keep relics within it. And if you look up at the lid, you can see the scenes on the lid, the Annunciation, the Visitation, the 2 women embracing one another, then the birth with Mary relaxing. And it always amuses me that in the Eastern image of the Nativity, Joseph is kind of sulking off in the corner. Yeah, he's not too sure about that. He's undergoing the Mediterranean male's horror story, being replaced by a god, being cuckolded by a god, as it were, about which he can't do anything but sulk. So basically, though, I want to celebrate the ivory. If you go to the next one, you'll be able to see the back of that. It's a magnificent artifact from the middle of the 11th century, as I said. And when Sarah and I were at the Abbey a couple of years ago, we thought we'd be glimpsing this, dimly through glass. And no, the Abbey brought it in, holding it in tissue paper into his study, put it on his desk and said, take all the time you want to look at it, examine it, photograph it, and I'll be back in about half an hour. So we had this priceless relics sitting right there for us. Now, moving from that to the next slide, I'm getting in to the more important thing we're going to be using today. They're called the Salerno ivories. If you can find them on the web, please do so. And if you ever find yourself south of Naples, do go to Salerno, because in the superb, and I'm underlining that, the superb Diocesan Museum, you wouldn't really think of even going there if you didn't know. The Diocesan Museum of St. Matthew, just beside the cathedral in Salerno, they are these magnificent series of ivories. And apart from them being magnificent, they're from ivory from Africa, because the people at Amalfi were trading with the Muslim people in Africa, and they brought ivory north to Amalfi on that magnificent Amalfi Drive. And then they carved these Old Testament and New Testament. This is the second thing I wanted to say here. Here, it's an integration, not so much between evolution, as it were, and Christianity, but between Old and New Testament. And these scenes are simply taken in the museum. If you go to the next slide, you can begin to see what they were. Look over to the right, and you'll probably recognize what is behind me in my virtual background. The best reconstruction, I mean, they're all separated, and basically nobody knows what they were for. Were they intended to be put on a pulpit, intended to be put on a bishop's chair? The best explanation, and it's the one from that book by the late lamented, died in his 50s, Robert P. Bergman, published by Harvard in 1980, from the Salerno ivories. He reconstructs it as 2 doors. So imagine those on the right-hand side as twin doors, and they would have closed off the chancel, that's the choir. So they would have been behind the very old pulpits you can see on both sides there. They would close off the choir from the, shall I say, the population, the audience, and you would be seeing them mostly closed, mostly. So he imagines them around the rim of them. You would have a sort of a decoration with little medallions, but inside you have 20 on each door of these 10 inches by 5 inches plaques, and we call them plaques, with 2 scenes on each one. So you have 40 scenes to left, 40 scenes to right, and the horizontal ones, you can see at the top, the horizontal ones are the Old Testament, the vertical ones are the New Testament, and it's magnificently integrated. It's not as if there's this little prophecy and this little fulfillment. It's a complete integrated story from the beginning all the way through. That's the 2 points I'm celebrating. First of all, the magnificence of the ivory. There's nothing like this collection from 1,000 years ago. This mini, all still there. Where you see gaps, that means that one has been lost, or it could be that some of them are preserved elsewhere. If you go to the next one, this is just to give you a close-up of what it would look like. On the left part of your screen, I'm showing the left door. So watch the integration. Across the top, running horizontally, I always think, you have the beginning of creation, the first 4 days of creation. See how they're doubled images, because each plaque obviously was big enough for 2 images, and you're not going to waste any ivory. So they get 2 images on each one. And if you're looking at the Genesis ones, you have the spirit moving on the waters, and night and day looks light, and night looks at knocks. And then the second one, you see God, who looks actually remarkably like Jesus, with a halo and everything. And he's creating the firmament, which means the angels. On the third day, you have him creating the plants. Then on the fourth day, you have the sun and the moon. And that, of course, explains why you had to have the light and darkness before you could have sun and moon, because what counts in Genesis, as you know, this is an aside, is the week. The crown of creation is the Sabbath day. So everything has to work on a week because it has to get to the Sabbath. We are not, by the way, the crown of creation. We are the work of a late Friday afternoon, and best work is never done on a late Friday afternoon. So this would continue all the way across into the other door. Then moving down, you can see how I've glossed over it. Yeah, let me hold this slide for a second, Trip. The Annunciation and the Magi and the Star, they run on 2 levels, as you can see, but they're linked. The Annunciation led into the Visitation, led into, oh, take a look at this one, by the way. Watch this one. Mary is telling Joseph. Mary is telling Joseph about the Annunciation. I presume, as we said the last time, there's good news and there's bad news. There's good news, the Messiah is here, but not your son. And then the dream. So in this case, we clearly have the dream of Joseph telling him, the angel telling him, not to break up with Mary. And then down below in the next level, the Magi and their star is missing. And then Magi before Herod, asking him about King of the Jews, and then giving their gifts. So this is what we will be celebrating throughout this as the background. I think we can go probably now to the next one. Okay, now just to give you a little bigger image, mostly because this is magnificent work. It really is magnificent work. The Magi and the Star, as I said, is lost. So we can presume that, because these are typical series that are all over in the turn of the millennium. So talking to Herod, and then giving their gifts, and then below, as we saw the dream, I've separated them, as you can see, so they're separate. Then the flight into Egypt, Mary with Jesus on the donkey, being led by an angel, and then the slaughter of the innocents. And then moving to the next one. All right, so that's the celebration. If you want to celebrate Christmas, look at the Salerno ivories. And again, all of this is available on the web now. I mean, it's extraordinary. Almost anything is there. if you get know enough information to go looking for it. So please look up the Salerno ivories if you want to see images to celebrate Christmas. Anyway, moving to our second section, questioning. There's going to be 5 main questions, going to the first one. And some of these, you've we've glimpsed in our first lecture. But I want to focus these around 3 themes, just to focus. Marriage, the marriage question, the massacre, and the escape. Marriage, massacre, escape. Now, emphasizing, the questions about the marriage, they are literary questions about Matthew. They are not psychohistorical questions about Joseph's mind. It's not, what's Joseph thinking? Why did he think this? The question is, why did Matthew say it? So then moving to the first question. Why did Matthew, unlike Luke Acts, so it's quite possible to do it differently, focus Jesus' infancy on Joseph, not Mary? Is it just raw, male superiority? Is that all that's going on? Why is Joseph so important and not Mary? Why does Joseph, for example, lead the whole story? Why, secondly, why would any writer place the conception by Mary before the Annunciation to Joseph? Isn't that a bad piece of writing? Couldn't he just have moved it up a bit? Because otherwise, what happens, of course, is he then raises the specter of adultery and divorce. And as we saw, the idea that Joseph would just put her away quietly in a small village get real. This finishes Mary's life for all practical purposes, even if nobody believes him, which is quite possible by Jewish law, that when an engaged male makes an accusation against his engaged wife-to-be, the presumption of innocence is on her, not with him. Going to the next one, next question then. Hold on to these. Oh, sorry, this is really more of this. Once you see this question, what it allows us to do, now we can move to the second one, it raises this whole issue of adultery and divorce. And then in the next slide, you can see what happens. So we'd be moving forward. What happens is this attack. I mean, Matthew kind of lays out hostages to fortune. He invites this attack. So anyone who wants to oppose Christianity has only to kind of sneer, oh, so it was adultery after all. So it was adultery. After all, Joseph thought so. So in the middle of the 2nd century, you get the pagan Celsus using also opponents, Jewish opponents, who makes the accusation that the pregnant mother of Jesus was turned out of doors by the carpenter. That tells us it's Matthew, by the way, he's reading. Doors by the carpenter. The father is the carpenter, Joseph the carpenter, to whom she had been betrothed, as having been guilty of adultery. You kind of want to tear out your hair and say, Matthew, what did you do? And then even though Origen, 100 years later, kind of finesses it by saying, well, if you admit that it was adultery, at least it wasn't ordinary human marriage. I'm not certain that was Origen's most brilliant response. But in any case, moving to the next one. This explains Matthew's defense. This is why we find 5 women. And we'll notice in a minute why these 5s keep coming up. Why we have 5 women in an otherwise male genealogy, when male begets male begets male. And all of a sudden, 5 women jump out at you. Tamar, who seduced Judah in Genesis, Rahab, the prostitute helper to the spies in Judges, Ruth, who seduced Boaz on the threshing floor in Ruth, and Bathsheba, who was raped by David, and Mary, suspected of adultery. So in the genealogy of Jesus, you have 5 women. What term do I use? Of suspect character or suspect character in the story? And that's why Matthew has to do this. Why in a totally patriarchal genealogy of male begetting male, these women jump out at you. 4 plus Mary, 5. So moving then to the next one. Those are questions about the marriage. Why did he raise all of this whole issue of divorce and possible divorce and adultery and all the rest of it? Now about the massacre. Again, these are literary questions about Matthew's text. They are not psychohistorical questions about Herod's mind. It's not an argument to say, well, Herod killed 3 of his own sons and 1 of his own wives, and Herod makes Henry VIII look monogamous and magnanimous, so that he would kill the kids, the young male children at Bethlehem was not surprising. Sure. But we're not talking about historical questions about Herod. We're talking about literary questions about Matthew. So continuing the questions then. The next question, and this is the one that I think if you have a young child who's hearing the Christmas story and doesn't ask this, then it's a delayed arrival of the faculty of reason, I think, or else they're scared to ask questions about the Bible. Why did Matthew have the Magi? Oh, no, sorry, I'm wrong. I'm reading the wrong question. That's the next question. This one is, why the Magi and not the shepherds? Why the Magi and not the shepherds? Why not somebody else? And of course, what we're dealing with is, this is the wisdom of the East. It's a rather simple answer. You don't have to even wait for it. The wisdom of the East comes to replace what the royalty of the West has failed to do. Herod has failed, and the wisdom of the East comes. They're Magi. They're the priests from Babylon. So now the next question is the one that I was jumping to a bit too much. And this is the question. This is the obvious question. Look, they've got a magic star. And for this story, you believe in magic stars, and everyone in the first century believed in magic stars. The star of Venus, had guided Aeneas all the way from Troy to found the Roman race in Italy, guided them across the Aegean to Italy. Now, actually, I should tell you, Venus, Aphrodite, was trying to guide Aeneas to Ireland, but they stopped off in Italy and blew the whole system. Anyway, here's the obvious question. Why did Matthew have this star-guided Magi, whose star could stop over a house and show them Bethlehem? Why did they have to stop off at Jerusalem to ask for directions? What's he up to? Now, as always, I'm never presuming, I may conclude, but I never presume that Matthew is just an incompetent writer. Out of respect for another writer, I don't presume that. I may conclude it, but it makes me think there's something really going on here that's very important. He has to get Herod into the story. The Magi can't just make a quick left turn and go down the Dead Sea. So then the fourth question. Why does Matthew have so many fivefold items? He's got 5 females. We just saw that, right? 5 females. And the whole story is guided by dreams. And there's 5 of them. Joseph is told to marry Mary. The Magi are told not to return to Herod. Joseph is told to flee to Egypt. Joseph is told to return to Israel. Look at this now. He's told to return to Israel and then to move to Galilee. You know, if you were being economic, you could say return to Galilee. But that would give you 4 dreams. So Matthew wants 5s. And then also, I put in that beautiful picture, by the way, of the angel telling him to I think this is the later dream. Of course, it's not the dream to marry Mary. It's, I think, to the dream to flee to Egypt. So, okay, moving to the next one, then the last and final question. And you have 5 prophecies. So you have 5 women, you have 5 dreams, and you have 5 prophecies. And when you look down through these prophecies, really, really, Matthew, dear, you're desperate. In plausibility, in credibility, they decline badly. By the time you get to the 5th one, Matthew, dear, you're just making it up. Now, the first one isn't bad. If you're going to tell, for example, the First World War, when it started, people kept saying, it'll be over by Christmas. Wars will always be over by Christmas. Well, in the ancient world, you couldn't say wars will be over by Christmas because you didn't have a Christmas. So you said, what? Wars will be over before a young woman, presumably a virgin who just got married, will bear her first son. 9 months, okay, by Christmas. 9 months is a good way to say by the end of the year. So Isaiah is simply reassuring the king that the invasion he fears will be over within 9 months. The Messiah from Bethlehem, oh, that's a good one. That's a really, really good one. Return from Egypt? And the mourning for the children that were slaughtered at Bethlehem? Oh, that's pushing it. And then that Jesus will be called a Nazarene? That just ain't there. So once again, I'm not underlining incompetence. I'm learning purpose. I'm underlining intention. He wants 5 prophecies and he's going to get them. And you're going to have them whether you like it or not. So now moving. That's the questioning. The final one is the escape. And by this time, you should almost know the answer. Again, we're not talking about historical questions. We're talking about literary questions. Why doesn't he have him escape over the Jordan into Moab, like in the book of Ruth? So if you turn to the next one. This is our final question. Why does Matthew have Jesus escape from Israel into Egypt? Hey, that's wrong direction. For the great escape is from Egypt into Israel. It's the exodus from Egypt. Do you mean that now Israel under Rome appointed Herod the Great is Egypt? And you want to escape the opposite direction. So this whole story is sort of climaxed. There's nowhere they could go except in the wrong direction, as it were, out of Israel into Egypt. They'll come back, of course, but that's the final point of the escape. So moving to the next image. We're now ready. Good. I'm pretty much on schedule. I'm keeping an eye on my time. We're now ready to slow down a bit and explain this. And in one sense, we're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's, because anyone who's even read Matthew and hasn't lights going on and say, young males are getting slaughtered in order to kill one male and the escape. Oh, that sounds like another story I heard somewhere else. So moving then to that other story. And the next slide then. All right, here's the thesis. The gospel according to Matthew proclaims the gospel. Let me imagine that the gospel is in front of you and there's no infancy. It starts on what we call chapter 3 and goes to chapter 28. Let's imagine Matthew has, as it were, finished his gospel and now he's ready to write his overture. The gospel, says Matthew to himself, proclaimed Jesus on the model of a new Moses. Let me emphasize that word. It's not new. We tend to think that new is the good and the old stuff, including people, is the old fuddy-duddy stuff. We want the new. The ancient world didn't think like that. If you were proclaiming the new, it would be far wiser to say it was the renewed. Caesar didn't have a new empire. He had a renewed republic. So new Moses means renewed Moses. Jesus is Moses turbocharged, as it were. That's why do not think they have come to abolish, but to fulfill. So Moses, as everyone knew, had 5 books, the Pentateuch in Greek, 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Matthew is going to have not 5 books, but 5 discourses. There'll be the first one. This is where it's really proclaimed on what we call the Sermon on the Mount, the worst title ever given to anything ever in the history of ever. It's not the Sermon on the Mount as if Jesus was up there lacking a megaphone. It's the new law from the new Mount Sinai by the new Moses. And then you have the mission discourse, the parables discourse, the community discourse, and the grand finale, eschatological discourse. So Matthew sort of sets up his gospel in a five-fold mini books. And then, of course, moving to the next slide, that means that, therefore, here's my thesis. The infancy overture for Jesus in Matthew 1 and 2, with its three main themes, marriage, massacre, escape, is deliberately modeled on the infancy overture for Moses, Exodus 1 to 2, with its three themes. The order now changes: massacre, marriage, and escape. But now, something really important has to be added. Because, you know, if you read the story in in Exodus 1 and 2, it's kind of brief on what's going on. Yeah, the finding in the bulrushes is a marvelous story, and bringing in Pharaoh's daughters is a marvelous idea. But, you know, you need a few more expansion. And so we bring in Midrash. Midrash. Don't get lost with Midrash. I don't like the word. It sounds like some kind of a disease, actually. It's simply, here's what's going on. If you're a storyteller in the first century, if you're a storyteller and you're used to telling, say, the story of Exodus, and you find out that people raise their hands because they're not polite like you and wait to the end of the lecture to ask questions, they interrupt and say, wait a minute, why? So you, as you tell the story, you incorporate into it expansions, glosses, but always with the intention of expanding it, giving more lessons. For example, supposing you're telling the story of the birth of Moses and somebody raised their hand, excuse me, Rabbi, got a question. Isn't it weird that God just had Moses born in the middle of a massacre? Isn't that kind of bad transcendental timing? Couldn't God have got Moses born a little before or a little after the general massacre? Isn't that bad timing? So we better explain what God is up to. Another question. Rabbi, another question. I don't understand how the Jewish parents, knowing that if it was a male child, the child would be slaughtered. Why would they go ahead and keep having intercourse? Why wouldn't they divorce or separate from one another? So those are the questions, precisely the questions about massacre and marriage, that are going to be answered in the Midrash that we have from the first century. We have examples from the first century, and they will be modeling then what happens to Jesus. And all of a sudden, we begin to see why Matthew has to raise this question of separation, and there has to be a massacre. So moving to the next one. All right, let me take you to this image on the western wall of the Dura Europa synagogue in Syria. It has been completely reconstructed in a separate building in the Damascus Museum. When Sarah and I were there a couple of years ago, 2010, the last year, could get into Damascus safely without a security vest. It was closed for renovations. My suspicion was it was probably just as well to keep it closed just for safety in case of any vandalism. But before you were able to go in, and down in the bottom of the corner there on the right hand, you can see it here. I'm using my cursor to show it. That's going to be the image you'll see in the next one. All right, now reading from right to left. We're reading as if we were reading Hebrew. We're seeing an image, of course, but reading from right to left. The first image there is the massacre. The triple plot, first of all, work the people to death. Isn't that a horrible antitype? Work the people to death, work the Jewish people to death, then have the Jewish midwives kill the male children. They refuse to do that. bravely, and then eventually have them drowned by the Egyptian people. So that's the triple plot for the massacre. Then that moves to the second thing. You could see the woman who's bending down there is Jochebed, the mother of Moses. She's putting it into the Nile for safety in the little wicker basket. The midwives are standing above her because they're the same people on the extreme left. You can see the daughter of Pharaoh finds him in the river, takes him out of the little basket, and she's shown nude, actually, even though it slightly later was kind of expunged slightly, but she's going into the water, of course, so she is nude, and then the child is given to the midwives on the extreme left. That's the scenario we're working with. And then here's the questions. So first question and the next slide. How do I know these questions? Because they don't come up in the Exodus account, but they come up in the Midrashim. Question, asked in the biblical Haggadic or narrative Midrash. There's also the halakhic or the legal Midrash. Storytellers wouldn't be touching that. That's more for experts. But a narrative Midrash, any good storyteller could make it up, and if they get it written down, we'll have it. So the first question about the massacre. Why did God have Moses born amid a general massacre? Yeah, isn't that tacky timing at least? And then in the next slide, you get the answer to that. And I know it's the answer because it's found in the Midrash. Oops. Isn't that again, no matter how often I go over this, there'll always be a typo the last time around. The massacre, massacre, sounds like an insurance program, massacre. The massacre was a particular one against Moses as the predestined child. So he just didn't happen to get born when the massacre was going on, but he was the predestined child, and the massacre was to get him. Now you see the much closer echoes now to the Pharaoh account and the Herod accounts. So let me look at the text. Going to the next one. All right, this is Joseph's Jewish Antiquities. And it's important that we have it from the 1st century, though my suspicion is this story was around much more fully, much earlier. We simply have 2 sources from the 1st century. This one explains the massacre as intended to get the predestined child. He's not named Moses, of course. Here's a text. One of the sacred scribes, person with considerable skill in accurately predicting the future, announced to the king, this is the Pharaoh, that there would be born to the Israelites at that time one who would abase the sovereignty of the Egyptians and exalt the Israelites, were he reared to maturity and would surpass all men in virtue and win everlasting renown. This is Josephus describing Moses, of course. Alarmed thereat, the king, on this sage's advice, ordered that every male child born to the Israelites should be destroyed by being cast into the river. That's the third method. Now, I'm sure you're hearing the echoes, so I won't beat you to death with them. But this is the detailed background of why Moses doesn't just happen to get born in a massacre. The massacre is to try and stop the predestined child from overwhelming Egypt, rather. So if you move now to the next one, please. So now, I probably don't even have to do this. You've got it already. Magi ask Herod about the king of the Jews. Where's the child who's to be born king of the Jews? So this is exactly the same to Herod, almost to Moses. The sages then announce the place of the predestined child, Jesus. He's asked Jerusalem. He's frightened. All the chief priests tell Bethlehem of Judea. Then the ruler decrees a massacre after they take off and don't come back and tell him. Herod saw he'd been tricked by the wise man, infuriated, killed all the children, at least all the male children, in and around Bethlehem, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. So we're now tracking much more closely with the Exodus Midrashim. And if you want to move to the next one, please, Chip. All right, back now to the second question. Remember, the first question had to do with the massacre and had to do with why did Moses get born during a massacre? And we found out the answer in order to get him, in fact. Now we're looking at the next scene, actually, on that almost magnificent comic strip on the wall. You're panning to the left. Moses' mother Jochebed puts the child in the river. But the question was this: why did Amram and Jochebed, their names are given, not separate at least, or divorce, or whatever term you want to use, to avoid chance of a murdered male child? Wouldn't surely they all have stopped? And again, now this is what inquiring minds asked of the text, and what the Haggadic narrative midrash answered as we move to the next one. Now I'm quoting. This is from a book scholars called Pseudo-Philo. There's obviously no person called Pseudo-Philo. That simply means it's anonymous. We don't know who it was, and used to be attributed to Philo, and so it's now called Pseudo-Philo. It's a book of biblical antiquities. What it's doing, somewhat like the Jewish antiquities of Josephus, it's retelling the biblical story with all sorts of glosses and expansions in the text itself. And these reflect, as we said, the oral comments from the storytellers. The image I gave you is a magnificent one of Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the law from the hand of God coming down from the cloud. And this is, of course, one of the Salerno ivories. All right, here's the text. The elders of the people decreed, a man should not approach his wife. General divorce. In other words, the obvious question. They decide not to have any intercourse, any marital intercourse, because they don't want to produce children, at least not even risk female children, male children. Then Amram, the father, says, I will not abide by what you decree. I will go and take my wife. I will not consent to the command of the king. And if it is right in your eyes, let us all act in this way. So in this case, he refuses to go along with any general divorce. God said, because Amram's plan is pleasing to me, he's rewarded. He who will be born of him will serve me forever. Because he trusts in God, he has faith in God that somehow it will be all right. And I will reveal to him my law. There's also a second account of this in here, but it's actually a separate one. The Spirit of God came upon Miriam, the elder sister of Moses, who was a prophetess, one night, and she saw a dream. A man said, go and say to your parents, he who will be born from you will save my people. At this point, actually, the midrashim tend to multiply. I just use this one. But the fuller story also says that Joseph, in one version, Amram is going to go along with the general decree. He says, all right, I will separate from Jochebed, no more children. And then it's in a dream. A dream. God comes to Miriam in a dream, and she tells him, in other words, go back and to your wife, because the child to be born is the predestined child. So they manage somehow in these expansions to answer the two major questions. And one final point. If you take this whole story, the whole story with other midrashim that are harder to date to the first century, but my suspicion is we're there already. The fuller story goes like this. Pharaoh had a, guess what? A dream, just like in the first chapters of Daniel. He has a dream. In this dream, he sees a scale. And in the scale, on one side, there is a young lamb, and then the other side of the scale is all of Egypt. And the lamb goes down, and Egypt goes up. The lamb totally outweighs Egypt. Then, next day, he calls together all his wise men, just closer even than Herod did with his wise men, and said, "What's the meaning of this dream?" And then they tell him, the predestined child, there is a predestined child to be born to the Israelites, the Hebrews, who will outweigh all of Egypt and will exalt the Israelites to the skies. And so the massacre is decreed, and so Moses is born, and so Moses escapes. So moving to the next one. So again, I don't want to pound you over the head by this. You probably got it clear. If you think of the themes as marriage, massacre, and escape, the problem over there with the Midrashim about Moses is the male child massacre. Amram, and like others, at least in the text that we have, in written text, refuses to separate, rewarded by having Moses as his child. Or he is warned about Moses by Miriam. Then over in the other one, now we begin to see why Matthew has to do it this way. There has to be a possibility of a divorce and a separation. There has to be a dream. And in that dream, Joseph has to be told, like Amram, go ahead with the marriage at least. The child is the predestined child. And once again, the massacre again, on one side, the evil ruler is Pharaoh, warned by sages of the predestined child. He decrees male child murder. Over now, the evil ruler is Herod. Pause for a second. That's a ferociously political statement. Herod is the Rome-appointed king of the Jews. We saw that possibly in the last one. Antony and Octavian had brought him into the Senate, declared him officially king of the Jews. That's his title. And then taken him up to the Capitoline temple of Jupiter for sacrifice and sent him home in the 30s to be king of the Jews. Any suggestion of somebody else as king of the Jews is treason. So the Magi are actually committing politely treason by suggesting there's somebody else as king of the Jews and nothing to do with Rome's approval. And then the escape, of course, the huge escape. There's the minor, I shouldn't say minor, but there's the first escape, of course, of Moses from being put to death by being taken care of by Pharaoh's daughter, which is a rather lovely story, actually. And then, of course, eventually Moses escapes from Egypt to Israel, as everyone knows. And then now the terrible, tragic irony is that now the only place Jesus can escape is from Israel to Egypt. Not because Israel has become Egypt, but because Israel under Herod, under the Rome-appointed Herod is Pharaoh. He's turning Israel into Egypt. Let me go to the next one as we are winding down. All right, now let me come back to, this is just there to remind me to come back to the original one. Remember what I said that I did my doctoral dissertation, my thesis in 1961. In 1961, at the Biblical Institute in Rome. Now that was the year before the Second Vatican Council started. It was a magnificent years to be in Rome. Oh, was it exciting! Anyway, I gave that whole argument. I gave pretty much everything there, except I did all the text and everything, fully text, and made the argument that Matthew 1 and 2 was a carefully calculated overture for Matthew 3 to 28. Now, my three professors, major professors that year, one was Augustine Bea. He was made a cardinal and put in charge by John the 23rd of Jewish Christian or Jewish Catholic relations in the Second Vatican Council. He was fine. He was fine. So insofar as I was talking about the Jewish scriptures leading into the Christian scriptures, modeling them and everything else, I was right with the program. That's where I first got interested in all of this. But two of my other professors, Stanislas Lyonnais, French, and Maximilian Zerwick, German, I graduated in June of 61. In September of 61, they were forbidden to teach in the year 61 to 62. They were put back in by the council. So when I did this and wrote my thesis, I was very much aware that no, I don't know if I would have used the word parabolic. I might just have said fictional. I might just have said maybe Matthew made it up, which is exactly what I think he did. Matthew made it up, but he made it up on the modeling, of course, of the Midrashim, which had been made up themselves to answer other questions. But I was quite aware that if I wanted to graduate, which I rather did after 2 years in Rome, and I was still under a vow of obedience and an order, it would not be wise to say that this was parabolic or fictional. I better leave it kind of open whether Matthew had done huge research, all sorts of information about the birth of Jesus, and sort of, I didn't say this, carefully picked out what would suit. Because the way I had to do it was the double negative. It is not impossible that. And not impossible that is not an historical statement. It's how you dance through a minefield of dogma. It's not impossible that, because all things are not impossible that. So I am arguing that it is a parabolic because it is an overture for sure. But then when I turned to Luke, I found exactly the same process, and we will next week. Luke doing the same thing for his Luke Acts. He's going to do the same thing. Now, maybe they both had a huge reservoir and each chose different materials. Matthew to suit Matthew, Luke to suit Luke, and they were all historical. But then, isn't it strange with all that data on the first years of Jesus, his infancy, they don't have a clue about anything, except maybe if you want to say Luke, when Jesus is 12 in the temple, there's a huge vacuum until he's 30 or about. That's kind of hard to believe. So I am convinced completely that the honest answer, unless you're doing apologetics, I'm doing research. If you want to do apologetics, you say it's not impossible. But I consider them parabolic. Finally, I'm going to be quite blunt. What's wrong with parables? When Jesus wanted to say something important about the kingdom of God, he didn't give a sermon. He didn't even give a lecture that I'm doing. He told a story, a parable. Now, you could argue, if you wanted to be really, really strange, that the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, they all actually happened, and Jesus knew about them in local gossip or familiar, and he just turned them into a parable by saying, go and do likewise. That's doing apologetics. There are scholars who do apologetics. I do research. And I'm going to say what I think is what Matthew intended and what Luke intended. And I think they were intended and written as parabolic, not historical overtures. And I suppose I would have to say, if we don't like that, take it up with Jesus, who started this bad habit of making up stories, and then with Matthew, who followed it. And that'll get us ready for Luke next week. All right. I think I am on Skadoodle for questions.
All right. Thank you, Dom. So one of the there were a couple questions around how you laid out these kind of parallel stories between Moses and Matthew in the book, and then you've outlined it here. And one of them raised it in an interesting way. This was Mark that sent it. He said, and this is me summarizing his question because it was long, that the story of the Exodus exists in history. Most biblical scholars think it had a similar origin, right? Yeah. In the sense of these parabolic overtures, that you get to a point you're now telling history, having an identity as the people of Israel that kind of explains, justifies, and gives your identity in the story. So Moses may or may not have existed, what he did or didn't do, all that kind of stuff. But Mark's question was, I find it fascinating that that story gets retold in ways that these midrashic wrestlings give answers to questions the text doesn't necessarily ask, but may provoke in different circumstances. The Gospel of Matthew, then, in this parabolic overture, in some sense tells this story of Jesus' birth as an answer to particular questions. Could Dom help us understand what questions the community of Matthew was asking that the early church may not have asked, or had to ask in a new way, that these midrashic or parabolic or overtures were answering?
I've touched on it in passing with Herod. I mean, there's no way you can tell this story without going political. Herod is, as I said, the Rome appointed king of the Jews. You are, even on the mildest form of this, you're comparing him to Pharaoh. Am I fleeing in the wrong direction? So this is a mandate for life. All right, if I'm in the first century any time, I'm under Rome still, and Rome is still appointing governors if they're not appointing puppet kings or client kings, to be polite. So this is a recipe for how you live. You look at the Herodians with very caustic eyes. That includes Antipas, his son. So all of this has immediate applications. In fact, if you put the two of them together, you don't get to the peace of Luke except by raising the questions about justice and Herod. So yes, they are mandates for living. Parables always are mandates for living. That's their function. Their function is to tease you into decision and action, to provoke you, to lure you, to lure you. Think, what does that mean? Why? But at the end of it, you're supposed to come up with a decision about action.
Yeah.
It's a very good question, by the way. Yes.
Well, do you think there's some of these in the comments now, but also we got sent a few similar like this. Maybe I'll ask two questions at once because they're related, and then you can take it where you want. Someone that used their initials, RK, asked, are there other historical examples of parabolic overtures? David asked, are parabolic overtures a common literary device that the audience hearing Matthew would have heard?
Yeah, I would think so. If you'd have to probably take them apart. But if you went back and read about David in his ascent to the throne, I would like to consider David and Goliath. Now, again, it's not impossible. A good slinger, and David was a slinger, all he has to do is stun Goliath for a minute. He doesn't kill him. He uses his own sword to kill him. And that's also maybe a parable. He's killed with his own sword. So I would be highly suspicious of whether that happened, but I don't see a single thing in there that makes it impossible. It's not he goes out like, with his hands and tries to punch him. He hits him with his, and slingers are formidable people in the ancient world. You don't fool around with slingers. So if he stays out of the range of his javelin, or on his sword, of course, stuns him. So I would say that screams parable at me. And I bet every kid growing up in Israel would have known that story and would have made the applications down the centuries to Rome as the new Goliath, of course, bigger and more massive, but has the weakness of being big and massive if you're fast and agile. So that's a typical one. And in the stories of I think I used them the last time, of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the other stories, not his own story, he doesn't even bother mentioning it, but crossing the Rubicon, you get whether there's a person telling him to come or to stay. Well, that's a little overture to what the person thinks the whole thing was about, good or bad for the Republic and the Emperor. Of course. Let me emphasize one thing. The world of literature and writing is divided into fiction and nonfiction. Please think about that. Everything else is nonfiction. So it's almost like fiction is the normative way of writing. But then there's theology and philosophy and science, all these other interesting ways, but they all get glommed together as nonfiction. That's why Jesus used parables, because he knew people liked fiction.
Do you Ryan sent the question this way, and I think it's a fun one. How do these birth stories compare as a historical Jesus scholar to the events in Jesus' public ministry, like his baptism by John or the feeding of the 5,000?
I'm not totally certain of the details of that. If I understand the question, it is, could there be other events in the life of Jesus that are parabolic? If I understand it to mean that
Yeah, well, I think in one sense is right, like your judgment as a scholar who spent quite a bit of time, doing historical Jesus research, early in your career, as you told in this, is that this text has, if you just attend to the text and its history, then it's a parabolic overture. That's what your conclusion is the best text.
yeah,
That's different than, say, when you think of the baptism of John or the multiple attestation of the feeding of the 5,000 and that kind of thing. Like how do you as a scholar kind of contrast what is happening in the same gospel narrative when it gets to those more historical or plausible or something like that text?
all right. It's a basic, for me, it's a question of matrix. As a scholar, I've had to read pretty much all the other stuff that was available at the same time to visit the sites of all of these places. I think I've ever visited almost every site, biblical site worth mentioning. I go to the museums until you get a feeling for the matrix. Now, you can never get it good enough because you're stuck in your own time and place, but you get a slight feeling for the matrix and for the type of stories. For example, when I read the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, what jumps out at me is, of course, this is a miracle. Of course, it's not some kind of, they're hidden under the rocks. Jesus takes, but these people believed that Jesus could bring manna down from heaven if he wanted to. In fact, that's what they'd expect him to do in parallel with the Old. Instead of which, he takes the food that's actually there, and when it comes through Jesus's hands, he blesses it, he breaks it, and there's enough for everyone. Now, that screams at me, it's a parable, dummy. The food that is there, including the fish, by the way. John's Gospel, chapter 6, doesn't want to talk about Jesus breaking fish. Of course, the fish are even more important than the bread because the fish belong to Antipas. So when Jesus breaks the food that's there, there's enough for everyone. That screams parable at me. There is enough food on this earth for everyone to get a fair amount, enough, with stuff left over, if justice handles the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the story says. It claims that if Jesus, as the symbol of justice on earth, distributive justice on earth, handled the distribution of food, or to put it in our sense, if Jesus brought up the federal budget, economic budget, it would be fair. That's the claim. It's done in a parable. I don't think for a second Jesus ever literally took bread. But if I thought I took it literally, I can say how very nice for them. They got a free meal. I can't do it. The Pope can't do it. The Dalai Lama can't do it. Nobody on earth can do it now. So I don't care. They must have done weird stuff in the first century, but that doesn't help me. If I take it as a parable, now it means something to me. Now it means there is enough food on this earth if it is distributed fairly. Ouch. That's a political statement. It's an economic statement, of course. So stay away from parables. I think it's much more advisable to say this is all literal and therefore irrelevant because nobody can do it now. Nobody's doing it now. So it's irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. So how last time you talked about how it's hard as a historian to understand, especially on our terms, how individuals in history took these stories, right? Did they really think Caesar or Jesus was conceived of the Holy Spirit or interaction with a God and such? And how much of that, there is a discussion in the homebrewed community group, is what a given individual or community thinks is or isn't possible metaphysically, right? So depending on how you imagine if there is an ultimate reality and its relationship to the world, how something like divine action would or wouldn't work, and all that kind of stuff changes the way you go to read and interpret one of these texts. And so much of the dominant of classical Christianity are the questions you ask these texts if you have a Platonic or an Aristotelian worldview, which isn't obviously what most of the early church had, or the Hebrew people and their stories. What role do you see those kind of metaphysical assumptions playing as a scholar trying to understand the history of it, but also how it's received and interpreted over time?
I actually see them as a magnificent and carefully designed red herring. All right? Because I am certain of one thing. These people took these with absolute seriousness, these stories. That I'm certain of, because they're willing to die for them. Now, whether they took them literal or not, then I can leave aside, because they took them seriously and were willing to live by them. And I don't know what else we ever live by except stories. I really don't. I honestly don't. Now, if you imagine the future as monarchy or oligarchy or democracy and live accordingly, then you're testing to see if it works. There is no other way human beings have ever lived. Now, if you have a model and the story is a parable, for example, or a myth, and you're living according to it, and you find that it works successfully, you create reality in the process of living out a story. There is no other way. We humans can create reality. The other species, they live out reality by instinct. They just do it instinct. We make decisions. And some of the decisions are horribly bad and create problems. So I think the whole debate in the first century, they were far easier, I grant you, of course. They knew what was literal and what was not. They really did. But they were certain that you lived by story. We are certain that we live by story right now. We can have an election according to two different stories. And if one story becomes the norm, we live accordingly. And then history will tell us whether that was a disaster or whether that was a brand new way of doing and highly successful. That's history judges, because history tracks along with evolution. And evolution won't let you do certain things. You don't get away with it. Not because there's divine punishments. I don't believe a word of that. But there are human consequences. It doesn't really make any difference whether you care about gravity or not. Don't jump off a 30-story building. First century, 21st century, and all the stuff that goes with it. So I want us to be really careful, honestly. If you ask me, do I think something actually happened? Literally, I will honestly answer you and tell you. I just did with the multiplication of loaves and fishes. But that's really, I don't think that was important. That was not what they were interested in. If Jesus is sitting by the lakeside and can bring fish out of nowhere, what about Antipas who's running the lake? That's political dynamite. And if you live according to that, then the days of Antipas are numbered. So that's what we humans do. We better take our stories terribly seriously.
So there are a couple questions in the chat related to the creeds. Would you see the ecumenical councils and the creed and the way it functions as an alternative story that then these biblical texts, are ultimately appropriated by? Or how would you see the coming of that framework for interpreting these texts?
A creed is by definition dated. If it is really good, then it defines at this time we don't do this and we don't do that. I could understand, for example, if the church in Germany in the 30s came up with a creed in which it is forbidden ever to use the word Führer. Now, that's totally dated. Or even wear jackboots. Or even as my German friends, when I met them at the university in the 60s, they said to me, don't say jawohl. And I said, what's wrong with jawohl? They said, that's what the Nazis said. It simply means Yes, yes, for sure. Yes, certainly. I thought it was perfectly ordinary. They said, don't use it. So a creed at its best says, we don't do this, we do that. That's what it does. Now, we do that all the time in our own groups. But a creed says, this is the law, you do this, you don't do that. They're all dated. A creed, by definition, is dated. And it may have value as a date. If you go back, for example, to the Nicene Creed, the problem at Nicaea was, what do you do with Jesus as the Son of God when the emperor is also the Son of God and has been for 300 years? How do you negotiate Jesus as the higher Son of God? Well, you go into Greek philosophy. I wouldn't. They did. I don't blame them. I understand that's all they had. And at the end, what they're trying to do is get home from Nicaea without being crucified, because the emperor is running the show. So a creed, by definition, at its best, is for that moment. This is what we stand for. And probably the next day it may be dated and obsolete and put it up on the wall like a picture of your ancestors.
So Noelle asked this question. It kind of picks up on that. She said these stories may be parables, but they, or maybe the tradition that's received them, make claims that the actual Jesus was born, which, I mean, you're not a mythicist, and was God incarnate. How does the recognition of these stories as parables impact our understanding of possible larger theological claims? Then she asks how it's similar to the position I end up taking later. Well, in my book where I talk about you, but the but I think it's interesting to okay, a lot of the evangelical people who have written in, and this is all new things to them, are constantly shocked that there's this large chunk of the church that has not had gatekeeping on certain ideas. And reading and enjoying what you're doing. They're like, are you telling me churches are doing this class in their Sunday school? And I'm like, yes. And so I think part of what Noelle's question is getting at is how that transitioning internally to seeing these as parables and such, how does that change the way we think about kind of the theological claims about the person of Jesus in the Christian tradition?
It changes them if you take them literally. Now, let me go back again and again. I know I've said this so often, I must be boring people. In the first century, before Jesus ever existed, Caesar was considered the Son of God. Now, that's not just a polite, let's say that, it'll make him feel good. That was a claim, let me insist, claim that this person's life had so revealed the character of God or the gods that we should follow this person and live accordingly. That's the claim. With Caesar, it's because he has created victory after 20 years of savage civil war. That reveals that God is peaceful, therefore. Now, to say of Jesus, there is no way God, however imagined, intervened in the biology of Mary and produced a child, literally. Not. That would be called rape. Well, maybe there's permission from Mary going, be it done unto me. So maybe this is consensual if you want to play that game. This has nothing to do with whether you see Jesus as the revelation of God, as the image of God, as God incarnate, as God in sandals. What you're making is a claim. And if you're making this claim, you better be ready to live it or you're just blowing smoke. That this is the way the world should be run. And if that sounds like a little bit like a political situation as much as a religious, oh yeah, you're getting it now. Now you're reasoning why some of these people are going to be dead, not because they're stubborn, but because they're living out their claim. The claim you're making is that Jesus is the revelation of God. In that language, son, in the patriarchal world, son, beloved son, only born son, means the heir. That's the heir apparent in the ancient world. How did you know the heir apparent? Because he sat on the right-hand side of the emperor. That's where you saw him on the coins and everywhere else. He's a parent, but he's the heir. So go into the New Testament, cross out son every time you find it, put in H-E-I-R, heir. That's the claim that's been made. Jesus is the heir of God. You want to see God's stuff? Take a good look at Jesus. You want to receive God's stuff? Live like Jesus. I cannot emphasize enough, just to be truthful, that huge claims are being made when these are read as parables. When they're read as literal, it's like magic claims. It's like somebody claiming that once upon a time you could float into the air. If you tell me that Jesus could walk on the Sea of Galilee literally, I'm going to say I couldn't care less. Good for Jesus. But I am very seriously involved in a story in which the disciples of Jesus take off in the boat by themselves. Along comes a storm and they're in trouble, and Jesus is out for a stroll in the waters, and they have to ask him back into the boat. So when the church takes off without Jesus, it's going nowhere in a hurry. It's a lot of motion, a lot of rowing, but no progress. Keep Jesus in the boat. Now, when I read that, it screams parable at me. Don't let Jesus out of the boat. And what I'm amazed by is that by the middle, whenever Mark wrote, even earlier than Mark, they had a story warning to keep Jesus in the boat. They already knew that there were people who'd let him drift off somewhere else. The church would be down here, and maybe he'd be up in heaven or having a morning stroll in the Sea of Galilee. Keep him in the boat.
Yeah.
It screams at me. I'm a parable dummy. Sorry.
Oh, no. And you may not believe this, Dom. Occasionally, religious institutions that call themselves churches actually center around power that's much more akin to Herod and Caesar and Pharaoh than Jesus. Did you?
Oh,
I know.
They do.
Yeah. And there's no better defense mechanism for being, confronted with the radical message of Jesus than to hit mute when you hear Dom start talking, because you're like, he doesn't believe Jesus walked on the Sea of Galilee, so he must be corrupting you, And there are a couple questions that asked to help make that specific for people that this is new, seeing the kind of political power dynamic. So as someone who's spent time wrestling with these texts and realizing that, say, the Gospel of Matthew is saying, like, what makes a wise man wise? Where they identified, right, the king of the Jews. What is happening in this parallelism between Moses and Jesus is that there's like this recapitulation of the divine facing down with the powers that claim the divine in the day. Like, as someone who's spent their life early in their career recognizing this, how has that changed how that lens of this parabolic overture, how has that shaped the way your faith helps you understand our present predicaments?
Honestly, I have quit on the Bible long ago. If you didn't, I've always disappointed the media because they want to know, you must have lost your faith. You came out of Ireland as a Catholic. You were deep in the Roman Catholic Church for 19 years, a monk, and then you lost your faith, right? No, I never was stupid enough to take it literally. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say stupid. That's rude. I'm sorry. I never was unwise enough to take it literally. It always came across to me powerfully. I mean, I always got the claim that was being made, and then focus on, is that claim valid? And do I see what's at stake here between a Jesus and a Sarah? Yeah, I think I see what's at stake. And yeah, so it always was there for me. I don't know why the whole Roman Catholic literalism, maybe growing up in Ireland, where we took it for granted as the wallpaper of the country, nobody ever told me growing up, you got to take this literally. Nobody looks at the wallpaper of your room and says, you got to take that literally. You just take it for granted. So I was maybe 5 years of Greek and 5 years of Latin, and reading that before I ever read the Bible helped too. So when I came to read these stories, they made absolute sense to me in the matrix of their own time and place. I'd already read Virgil when I was 13 in Latin. So I knew how to make a story. And we weren't battered over the head by our teachers saying, I don't take this literally. we're able to hear the story, understanding it as advertising or something, and then go straight into it. But what I never lost was that huge claims were being made by these stories, and they were being evaded by taking them literally. The function of taking it literally is to evade it by saying, well, we can't do that today. Nobody today could take loaves and fishes and multiply them and feed everyone. So we can't do that. Therefore, what? So I would ask people, evangelical people, please read the parables. Try and understand why Jesus found it expedient, necessary to tell parables. Why not give a good fiery sermon about hell? What happens in a parable? And what happens is that lures you in. It makes you participate. There's no secret to this. The function of a parable is that after you hear the parable of the sower, you go home to your wife and say, I heard this guy this morning. I think he's nuts. He told us what we all know. Don't put bread. Don't put the seeds on the. I knew about that. Watch for thistles. Watch for birds. I'm a farmer. I listened to this idiot all morning telling me how to farm. And the wife would have said, Joseph, Bar Benjamin, nitwit, it's a parable. Oh, but he didn't say it was a parable. Well, it was a parable. When he tells you something there's something else going on. Oh, so it was a parable. It wasn't about the birds and the seeds and the thistles you got it. But now he has to figure, well, then what was it about? And that's when the argument starts between himself and his wife. So parables make reality.
Yeah. So there's two more questions that are specific about Matthew. One is you mentioned briefly about the women in the genealogy, but both in the comments and there are three different questions. Sybil is one who sent in a really extensive reflection on the women. And I wonder what you see going on in the selection of those particular women and what it's saying about Mary, Joseph, and the birth of Jesus.
Well, a lot of scholars, including the late Ray Brown, talks about the four women. Now, I think there's five women because, first of all, I'm watching fives in Matthew, but you could argue then, well, there's four women and they're all pagans. So this is Matthew saying that pagans were, well, I don't know why they're more pagan. I don't know why Bathsheba is more pagan than David. She's certainly a better person. But I don't see it as pagans. I just don't see it. So I'm asking myself, how does this five-some come together? And what light do they cast upon Mary? And the only light I can see is some term like suspect, unusual, to use a more polite term, unusual relationship. Bathsheba marries David, I presume produces Solomon, but she has been I almost said royally raped. I'm sorry. I did not intend that to be funny. Raped by a king, forced by a king. So the only sense I can make is that these women were all unusual in their relationships, and that's what he associates Mary with. Otherwise, I don't know how the five-some holds together.
Yeah, I think it was Phyllis Tribble, feminist rhetorical scholar at Union, that talked about how all of them in different ways expanded the agency of females in their context and such like that. But it's definitely one of those if right, the examples you give of the story of Exodus generate questions that then the Midrash develop answers to, that those five females are a part of the genealogy, I think sit there as a question that helps us generate new questions and wrestle with it, and recognizing the way so many women's names and experiences have been silenced in religious settings and text. It's an important one, or it's definitely an opportunity, especially for those who notice the lectionary skip over it.
Yes, exactly. And I would insist too that whether you can find feminism in the Bible or not, That's the Bible's problem. If it ain't there, it should be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if we can find it, we never find it enough, because we're talking about half the human race.
Mm-hmm.
Until half the human race are accepted as equal, we'll never be there.
Yeah. So the last kind of specific to Matthew questions that came up were about the significance of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem and the family being from Nazareth. Are there larger purposes for it than the the postulation of a fulfilled Bible verse in one of the 5 fulfilled, or is it connected to what we know historically about Jesus and such?
Yeah, quite deliberately, I took out the virginal conception and the birth, the Bethlehem birth. I kept them for the very final one, all by themselves, because we begin with differences. There's two major things besides the names, of course, of Mary, Joseph, and that. There's 2 major things that Matthew and Luke both have. They both have a virginal conception. Now, Matthew ties it to 7:14 and Isaiah. Luke doesn't, but they both have a virginal conception, the Holy Spirit and Mary. So that's prior tradition. Now, I'm not arguing, therefore it's true. I'm saying, somebody say it's older tradition, and also born at Bethlehem. So the last lecture is going to be very serious. Born at Bethlehem means he's the Davidic Messiah. And the consensus of that in the 1st century, if you said Davidic Messiah, means a military leader, certainly suffused with divine power. So you're not just an ordinary guy, but you are using military tactics. So a new David is a very, very fraught one. And that touches a little bit back on Matthew one last time, because Jesus is the Messiah. He's the son of David, without a doubt, from Matthew. But all of a sudden, Moses comes in. Wait a minute. Where did Moses come from? Shouldn't this be Abraham to David? And isn't this the son of David, the Messiah? Why? Matthew cauterizes the Davidic Messiah with the Mosaic model. Because one thing Moses is not a warrior. He's a lawgiver. Aaron is the warrior, if you will. So those are very important questions, and too important until the 4th. They'll get the 4th lecture will be all about that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Dom, I've really, really enjoyed this again. And I know everyone it probably feels this, but thank you so much for taking so much time to prepare the visual lectures. I got messages from people who've done multiple other classes with me before, and they always just listen to the audio, and they message. They're like, I was about 10 minutes in his talk. I was like, I'm going to have to wait till I can sit down and watch the video. And people, and so like, not only was it helpful, and you talked last time about how it's helpful for you thinking it out to look at the pictures, but I think for all of us learning, be it in a group or by yourself, it's a real treat. And it's been a complete blast. If anyone that's here, remember, you can continue to send questions. Everything will be up on the resource page before I go to bed tonight. And you can always invite your friends and tell them, oh, come catch up, join us next week live. It's been a blast. So any parting shots, Dom?
The only thing, Trip, I've never done anything like this. The idea of having this up for a year so that normal human beings can take their time, take as long as it takes me to get these images and choose them and everything else. I think it is marvelous. I think this is education, rather than, a guy talks and maybe you see a few pictures and then he disappears into the. I think this is the way education should be done. It's there, you can work on it, and then you can always come back and have extra sessions just with questions. I mean, I think it's a fabulous way to do education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Fabulous. So
as you're reading the Luke narrative this week, if you have questions, make sure you send them our way. If they're specific about the text, send them to. In the last episode, we'll pick up more of the questions around the evolution references. There's a whole stack of questions around it that I knew we'd detour and then not spend time with Matthew. So keep sending them. We might do a whole separate Q&A thing just around the Bible, evolution, and religion, or whatnot. Dom said he's open to it, so don't not send those. But we don't want to short script Matthew or Luke in these, since you know, they are the canonized Christmas stories.
I would be very happy, Chip, to do it, an hour or 2 hours afterwards, just on Q&A if you want to, because I know we don't get through all the questions.
Yeah, but I do read them all 600 and some I've gotten so far. I've read them all and power ranked by topic. So if you didn't get direct responses from me, everyone, I have read them all. Even the ones giving me advice on how to trim my beard, which I never gotten that one in a class before. But yeah. Anyway, I'm totally down to have a have a long Q&A. So remember that, everyone. Don't hesitate to send your questions. We'll have some fun. So until next week, we will see